Good afternoon. My name is Neil Dwyer, and I teach English at the College of Southern Maryland. And it is my honor to be part of our International Week celebration of Korea. It's something that I think we can bring to our students in a way that we can't in class, basically. And I think the more opportunities students have to experience a different culture, however they experience it, even if it's, in this format, which may not be ideal, it's a lot better than thinking that this is the only place in the world. And these are the only values in the world. So welcome to our program. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen is a professor emeritus at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where he taught economics for 35 years. Trained as a mathematical economist, Professor Nguyen's academic interests in later years expanded to include social, historical, political, and cultural issues in East and Southeast Asia. As such, his courses covered topics from globalization, impact in Southeast Asia, to the economics of the sex trade in this region. Professor Nguyen and I will have a conversation today to share his perspectives on the topics of family, education, and economy in Korea by one key cultural element: Confucianism. Professor Nguyen will speak from the point of view of an economist who has had extensive professional and personal background in East and Southeast Asia. Please note that there is a chat link at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to ask questions as the session proceeds. And we will touch on those questions either as they come in or at the end. But to begin our conversation, so welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. To begin our conversation, I'd like to ask you how Confucianism undergirds so much of Asian culture.
Thank you, Neil. I guess it's my turn. For all the people out there listening in, I must confess that I retired from full-time teaching 7 years ago. So technology like this is really new to me. Things like Zooms and online teaching is new. So if I have any hiccup, please forgive me. As a Confucian would say, we have to be modest. We have to be humble, and I apologize before anything may happen. First of all, I'd like to thank the College of Southern Maryland for this opportunity, and especially the Global Initiative Committee for having trust me enough to have me for an hour with you all. Now, when I was asked to talk about family, education, and the economy, I struggled to see how I would approach these three topics. And then it hit me. Aha, there is a common element, as Neil said, there's a common element which is quite unique to the case of Korea, and that element is Confucianism. So who was Confucius? Who is this man? Actually, he's a Chinese, born in the eastern part of China, about 550 BC. That's half a millennium before Jesus Christ. So he'd been around a long time. But his influence is still very, very strong, especially in East and Southeast Asian countries. And let me just list these countries geographically, going clockwise, starting with his country of birth: China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Singapore. But in my opinion, I believe that the impact or the influence of Confucianism is strongest in the country that we are discussing today, that of Korea. And by the way, when I say Korea from now on, as all of you would know, there are two Koreas. North Korea and South Korea that had been created in 1945, September 1945, at the end of the Second War. But when I say Korea, from this moment on, I mean South Korea for short, okay? Now, so how does Confucian does all this that I claim to tie these three topics together, the economy, the family, educational system, and so on? Well, we will spend the rest of the time discussing that. But for some of you, you might have heard of Confucianism from your fortune cookie. That's not Confucianism. Sometimes you open up your fortune cookie after you have your Chinese lunch or dinner, and one of those pieces of fortune would say Confucius says something. That's all made up in a back room in New York somewhere where they're making the cookies. Now, is Confucianism a religion or is it not a religion? Well, it is a religion in the sense that it is a guide to people living, to how to live a respectful life. So in that sense, like a religion, it gives guidance to day-to-day living. But it is not a religion in the following sense, the sense that we typically think of religion. First of all, it has no written body of canons of tenets. There's no Bible, there's no Torah, there's no Quran. Okay, so in that sense, it's not a religion. It has no physical structure like a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a pagoda. So another absence of item that we typically think of a religion. It also has no professional class of clergy like priests or pastors or imams or rabbi and so on and so on. So, and it also does not have specific rites for death, for birth, for introducing people to the religion or welcoming them in, such as in baptismal ceremonies. So it doesn't have any of that. But it does have a strong impact on people's life in all this country, and as I claim, especially in Korea, where I had the opportunity to visit for one summer as a Fulbright scholar. And as a Fulbright scholar, I was taken to many places, to temples, to factories, which we'll go later into in more detail. And I was even taught Korean language. So what is then the central tenets, the central focus of Confucianism? It focuses on the family, and officially it's called filial piety. Filial piety means the obedience, the respect for one's family, starting at the top, which is the father. And imagine you're looking at a totem pole. Totem pole is from top to bottom, right? At the top, you have the father, and then the older son, and then the younger sons, and then the mother, and then all the other female siblings. Now, this same concept of, so it's very rigid kind of ranking system. If you notice, the father comes before the son, the older son comes before the younger son, and so on, because relationship in Korea or under Confucianism is so important that when you think of simple words like brother, in English, we have only one word to describe one's male sibling, right? I may ask Tyree Smith here, because I see your face on the screen. How many brothers do you have? You would say, I have 2 brothers. Okay, just go along with me here. In Korean language, which is called Hangul, she would say, I have blah, which means an older brother, blah, blah, which means a younger brother. So my point here is because gender and ranking and relationship are so important that in the Korean language, there are different words for older brother, younger brother, older sister, younger sister. In fact, if you extend that horizontally, in English, there's only one word for uncle. If you go to Korea, you say, I have an uncle, someone would immediately ask you, is that uncle of yours older than your father or younger than your father? There's different names for those uncles. And then the next question would be, is he on your mother's side or your father's side? You see, Confucianism emphasized the totem pole effect, the rigidity of relationship. So there's different words, which because to a Confucius society, who you are and your relationship to your family, to your community is so important. That's why they have these different words in their language. We have it so simple. Uncle, aunt, brother, sister, that's it. I suppose it's not much different from Inuit language, where you may know there are 7 different words for snow, because Inuit people live in an environment where the weather, the snow condition is so important. By saying this word, they mean falling snow. By saying that word, they mean automatically snow on the ground. By saying another word, snow is wet. Another word, small flake. So you see the point. Language is important. And I suppose someone such as Professor Dwyer here, who teaches poetry and literature, would understand the importance of language. Okay. Now, so the central focus of Confucianism is filial piety, which is obedience and respect and so on to your family and your place in the family. And by the way, before I leave that altogether, I kind of touch upon it lightly, but I should also say that Confucianism is very sexist because it put the father over the mother. And in fact, the relationship on your father's side, your uncles and your aunts on that side, or grandparents on that side, are more important, have higher value than all those people on your mother's side. Okay, so very sexist. And a woman, when she's young, before she gets married, has to obey her father. He's the male figure in her life. Once she gets married, her husband become her male protector, and should her husband predecease her, then it would be her older son that she must listen to. So there are good things with Confucianism, but there's some in our modern time very much negative. Now, in defense of Confucianism, I should say this, that when Confucius was alive, 6th century before Christ, he lived in a place which is now called China, but it was not a unified country. It was warring states, different smaller states that was always at war. So there was a lot of chaos. So Confucius emphasized orderliness. He emphasized ranking. He ordered one's place in life. He emphasized harmony. So in that sense, it gave China at that time peace. And that's why later emperors in China loved to adopt Confucianism, because it put the king or the emperor at the very top of the totem pole. He, the king, the emperor, is the son of heavens, to use the family analogy. Okay, so for a Confucius person, for a Korean person, not only he see himself in his family, but that also extend beyond his family into the community at large, to the country, to the nation. So he must also give tribute and obedience and respect to the emperor. That also applied to the other community, namely his workplace, his employer. And I will go much more in detail later, but when I was a scholar Fulbright Scholar in Korea. I was taken to visit many factories, many shipyards and temples and museums and such. I was taken to see the shipyard, Hyundai shipyard. I was taken to see Hyundai car manufacturing plant, and I was taken to see different Hyundai steel plants and so on. And one day I actually witnessed 2,000 or so Hyundai employees early in the morning, 7 or 7:30 in the morning, in company's uniform, doing calisthenics and singing company songs before they report for work. And that is, you see, so Confucianism is pervasive everywhere, not only in the family, in the country, but also at the workplace, where the boss, the manager is like your father. And you have to fit into that system, which is what Confucianism is all about. Right? Now, how does this have to do with, so you have some sense that family is important. Going through, excuse me, I just got here to Monterey, California, less than 18 hours ago. I'm staying with a brother of mine, and anyway, he's bothering me around. Oh, I thought he thought I was just rehearsing. Okay, so that's a hiccup. Sorry. Another positive aspect of Confucianism is that places very high value on education, on being learned. Because if you think about that analogy again that I used earlier with the totem pole, your place is fixed in life, in your family, in everything. However, there's only one way you could be upwardly mobile, as we now call it in modern time. The only upwardly mobile mobility you could have is through education. So back in Confucius days, in the traditional time, there was such a thing as national examination, that by passing that national examination, which was very tough, it's open to all men. No women were allowed to take it. So again, you see that sexist side of Confucianism. For a man to pass the national examination, he would then be appointed a court official, a Mandarin. Okay? And in such a way, even a peasant, even a poor man could make something of himself, and in doing so, he can help his family. Okay, and so nowadays we call that corruption, but under Confucius system, helping your family is not corruption at all. It's part of one can do one's best to help. Now, I have here some statistics regarding the importance of education in Korea in Confucius society, and in this case, Korea. I looked at a website called myschool.com, and in it, I found that Korea is ranked number 3 in the world in terms of literacy rate. It ranked number 10 in overall number of high school and college graduates. That is how important education is to Korea. Now, speaking of literacy rate, I am an Asian American first, and specifically I came from Vietnam. In fact, exactly 1 week from today, on April 15, 1 week from today, I will have been here for 60 years. 1 week from now, it will mark my 60th anniversary in this country. Okay. Now, So I know about Vietnamese, and I have traveled all over Asia and South Asia. And for the last 6 years of my professional life, I was also the Asia Initiative Director at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where I oversaw exchange programs with Asian countries and South Asian countries. So I do know a bit about these places. Now, if you look at Japan, what is the Japanese writing system? Well, Japanese writing system is basically using Chinese characters. If you look at, let's say, Thai language, the writing system in Thailand, it uses Sanskrit and Pali, which is based on India. If you look at the Vietnamese language system, up until maybe 300-400 years ago, the Vietnamese, like the Japanese, also used Chinese character. However, for the past 400 years or so, the Vietnamese language adapted Latin alphabet. And that's why Vietnamese learner of Western language like French or English find it much easier because we already know our ABC. Now, coming to Korea. Korea, of all these other Asian countries, Korea is the only country that has its own writing system. And it wasn't invented just 100 or 200 years ago. It had been around since 1443. The Korean king was so far-sighted and so knowledgeable. He had a committee of scholars, and he assigned them the task of coming up with a writing system, which is called Hangul. In English, it's spelled Hangul. Okay. Now, when I was in Korea for the summer, I the first 2 weeks I was given Korean lesson, and I actually learned how to read in Korean with their alphabet. It's very scientific. It's very logical. I could read, but I would not be able to understand. I could read verbally. Okay, so that's how logical and how scientific Korean language is, and it's the only country in Asia, aside from China and India, that has its own writing system. And so you have this very high value placed on education, and I believe that comes from the Confucius influence in Korea, with a high number of high school graduates, a high literacy rate, with a large number of college graduates. And I will now, unless you have questions, by the way, any of you have any question, please type it in, and Professor Neil Dwyer will then forward it to me and we can discuss them. Okay, but as you know, many of you, if you look around, you may be driving a Korean car, a Kia, a Hyundai. You look at your home, you may have a Samsung refrigerator like I do, Samsung television, good quality for very reasonable price, right? I even have a Samsung stove, an oven, and microwave oven. And that's my Samsung S8. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, for sure, you would not have heard of any Korean company. Now, take a look at the name that I mentioned, the Hyundai. Hyundai is now the 9th largest automaker in the world in terms of revenue. So I have it in my head. I looked it up this morning. According to Investopedia.com, the largest automaker in revenue is Toyota. Anyone could guess that. The second largest is Volkswagen. The third is another German company, Daimler, that makes Mercedes-Benz and so on. Okay. Number 4 is the first American company that make this list is number 4, Ford. Number 5 is another Japanese company, Honda. And number 6 is Bavarian Motor Works, which we know as BMW. Number 7 is General Motors. Now, many of you are too young to remember this, but in the 1950s, the popular saying back then was, what is good for the general is good for America. The general meaning General Motors, okay? And now General Motors only number 7 automaker. Number 8 is Fiat Chrysler. It's not Chrysler Fiat, it's Fiat Chrysler, because Chrysler went bankrupt. Mercedes Daimler-Benz bought it out. It couldn't manage it, so it sold it Chrysler to Fiat. That's number 8. Number 9 is Hyundai. Number 10 is Nissan, another Japanese company. Okay. Now, I listed them to impress you with the fact that Hyundai is now number 9 automaker in the world, and yet it is the only one that makes the highest rate of return, of simply put, profit. Now, since I have in front of me here a piece of paper with these numbers, let me recite them for you. Toyota return rate is 1.8%. Not that high, but still positive. Number 2 is Volkswagen with return rate or profit rate of 11.2%. Daimler comes in at 9.8%. Ford return rate is negative 24.5%. Okay. Honda, we all love Honda. Its profit rate is 2.4%. Okay. BMW, the other German company, is doing pretty well too, 12.9%. General Motors, remember what is good for the General is good for America, negative 17.4%. So far, the two American automakers that I mentioned both make double-digit losses. Fiat Chrysler profit rate is negative 19.5%. Negative. Now, are you ready for this? Hyundai rate of return is 35.7 positive. Amazing. By the way, Nissan, the number 10 on the list, is minus 37.2. Nissan's in real trouble. Now, not only Hyundai makes so much money and now it become number 9 in the world, but it only exported cars to America in 1986, the first time ever, 1986, with only one model. My brother actually bought one of those. It was a Hyundai Excel, a 1.5 liter little two-door economy car. And yet in the very first year, Hyundai sold 160,000 copies of that very first car. And it didn't even make it from scratch. It borrowed technology from this Japanese company called Mitsubishi. Now, Mitsubishi is the third tier down in terms of automakers, okay? But Mitsubishi used to make the fighter plane during Second War. The Japanese fighter plane that was so good, and American airmen had feared the 0, as in number 0. It was very good fighter plane, and Mitsubishi made that. And Mitsubishi gave technological help to Hyundai back in the mid-80s so that Hyundai could make these cars and this engine. And before I leave the auto industry altogether, I should tell you that as we are speaking, Hyundai is now selling technology and engine to Mitsubishi and to Fiat Chrysler. Now, isn't that amazing? And yet, Korea is a very small country. I will put it to some term that you can relate to. It's only the size of Indiana. It only has 51 million people. We in this country has about 330 million. Korea only has 51 million people. And when the Korea War ended in July 1953, Korea was the poorest nation on earth. Why? because that war was so devastating. It killed 5 million combatants. Small country, and yet 5 million people was killed during the 3 years of war, from June 1950 to July 1953. Okay. By the late 1950s, 7-8 years after the war ended, the Korean per capita income, that is GDP, gross domestic product, which is income divided by population, was at par, at the same level as Haiti. In the early 60s, the same figure, namely per capita per person income in Korea, was the same as Ghana in Africa. Now, in 2021, no one would ever think or put South Korea in the same census as Ghana or Haiti at all. It is now the fourth largest economy in Asia and the 10th largest in the world. Now, in Asia, who are the other three that are having larger economies than Korea? Well, the first one is, as you may guess, China. The second one is Japan. The third one is India. Think about those countries. You should all know these countries, India, China, Japan, all dwarf South Korea, both in size and in population. China has roughly 1.4 billion people. India has roughly 1.3 billion people. Japan has roughly 130 million people. And China and Japan have been industrialized for a long time. Remember Pearl Harbor? Japan attacked America December 7th with aircraft carrier, with planes that took off from ships. I'm not praising them as such. I'm just saying that the level of technology by the Japanese by 1941 was so advanced. And yet, we now can think of Korea in the same term as Japan. Okay. Now, so how did Korea get from one of the poorest countries to one of the wealthiest, number 10 in the world? This rise was so phenomenal that people, economists especially, have used the term Asian tigers, Asian dragon to describe the South Korean economy. And in the 70s, people used the term miracle on the Rhine River. That's to describe West Germany's economic rise. They used the term miracle on the Han River, which is a river that flowed through Seoul, the capital of Korea, to describe what the Korean had achieved. Okay, so how did they get from nothing to something? Again, I don't want to take anything away from the Korean people, but first of all, it's them. It's educational system, highly educated workforce. It's the work ethic. Okay, but at this point, I must bring in some other dimension that has nothing to do with Korea or Korean people or Confucianism. During the rapid rise in economic development for Korea, it just happened to coincide with the Soviet Union on one end and the US on the other end, which started when World War II ended. Professor Dwyer, you have some question for me? Or should I go on?
Oh, no, I've been dying to jump in, but I've been so intrigued by your discussion, I hesitated to do so. Wayne would like to know.
So let me go on then, if you don't mind, so I don't lose my train of thought. I just thought when you move around, I thought you had a question for me. Okay, so for the student and for all the members of the audience, let me go back to end of World War II, May in Europe and August in Asia. Okay, what we observed at the end of World War II, 1945, was this big block for the Soviet Union in eastern part of Europe, and the other block in Asia called China. And certainly by 1949, these two blocks become one and painted red, namely, it was a big communist bloc of Soviet Union and China. And clearly, even though Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, the big three, were very much allies during the Second War against the evil of Hitler, Nazism, and Japan. By 1944, it was by near the end of World War II when victory was obvious. It became very clear that this gap between East and West, between communism and capitalism, cannot be bridged. And that's why when the Nazi was defeated on May 1st, 1945, the big three, namely Soviet Union, UK, and US, decided to split Germany into two halves, East Germany and West Germany. A couple of months later, 3 months later, when we America dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. Japan cried uncle and gave up, surrender. Japan then had to move out of Korea. And this part, some of you might not know, so I should go back just a bit. Between 1910 and 1945, Japan had annexed or colonized Korea, made Korea, the whole of Korea, North and South colony of Japan, set up production, set up mining and so on, set up farming, just to serve the mother country, namely Japan. So when Japan surrendered in August 1945, again, the Soviet Union and the USA agreed to split Korea into two halves, North Korea and South Korea. Along this same historical line, I should continue just briefly. In 1954, similarly, Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam, and mainland China and Taiwan was also split, one going with the West, one going with the East. So that was the creation of the so-called Cold War. Okay. Now, so what does the Cold War have to do with the phenomenal rise of Korean economy from the 60s to now? Well, I would say that when this red bloc of communism threatened US national security, we, the policymaker in Washington, D.C., decided to apply what they call containment policy. What does American containment policy involve? It involved building up or rebuilding West Germany in the West to make sure that Russian tank would not take over Western Europe. In the East, instead of punishing our former enemy, Japan, we help Japan to build up. So this containment policy means we give economic help, military help. We did everything we could to put roadblock to the Western expansion of Russia and Eastern expansion of China. How could we do it? Well, if you recall, by the end of World War II, most of our now economic competitors, Germany, Japan, UK, you name it, were in ruins. In fact, Russia lost 24 million people during the Second War. Germany lost between 6.6 to 8.8 million. No one knows for sure, but a large proportion of that population. By the way, the US lost only 418,000 casualty, death during Second War. So compared to what the Soviet, and by the way, Japan is somewhere around 3 million people who died in the Second War. So compared to those countries, the US was pretty much left untouched because we have natural defenses, Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean. The war was never fought on our soil. There was never any Japanese troop on our land. There was some German spies who landed in Maine and so on, who went and spy on us. The German did by U-boat. But there's no bombing, no destruction of rail lines, of ports, of airports, of anything, of factory. So at the end of World War II, the US GDP, gross domestic product, how much we produced in 1945 was about half of the total global output. Half of that came from the US. In other words, we had economic means, we had the financial means to do whatever we wanted to help our friend, our former enemies, West German, our former enemy, Japan, so that we can contain communism, our former allies, Soviet Union. That's the black and white of the Cold War. Okay, so I would call the military and ideological situation in 1945 that of bipolar situation. Bipolar in the sense that on the one pole we had the Soviet Union, politically, ideologically, militarily opposing the other pole, namely the USA. Okay, economically, I would use the word unipolar to describe reality as we saw it in 1945. Unipolar means economically there's only one superpower, the US. And that's why we did not care, we did not mind if the Korean, the Japanese, the Germans had not so ideal democratic system, especially in Korea, which I will go into very soon. We bought anything they produce, okay? And by the way, if you recall, I mentioned earlier, the Korea War lasted from 1950 to 1953. We bought a lot of supplies from Japan to use during the war in Korea. Now, Cold War is not so cold. Cold War is very hard for some people. The place I came from called Vietnam. There was up to 500,000 American troops in Vietnam at one time for the decades of the 60s up until 1972. It was very hard. We, America, used every modern weapon at our disposal to try to defeat the Vietnamese. The only weapon we had not used was the atomic bomb, nuclear bomb, because we had already used it in August 1945 against another Asian enemy, namely the Japanese. And there was some hesitancy in using it again against another Asian nation. So, but we used everything else. 20,000 pound bomb, B-52, everything we had, F-111, aircraft carrier, we use everything, okay? So in doing so, because in defense of, our national interest in this containment policy, and part of this is the part that Vietnam War is involved in is the so-called domino theory, that if Vietnam falls, then Thailand would fall, Taiwan would fall, Korea would fall, Japan would fall. So we have to make our stand in Vietnam, okay? So, but to make it more international effort in name, we recruited soldiers from Australia, from the Philippines, from Thailand, from New Zealand, and from Korea to help our effort in Vietnam. Everyone saw through the first. There's only about 1,500 Australian troops. They didn't do much. There's some New Zealand medics. There's some Thai, over 1,000 Thai soldiers, same number of soldiers from the Philippines, except Korea. We used 60,000 South Korean troops in Vietnam. Not only we use them, we train them, we equip them, we paid them, and Korean was so willing because they needed the foreign currency and also they needed training because they were under threat by North Korea. So not only we did that, but we supported Korean economy, especially in the first few years, in the first decade or so after 53, by running the budget, giving money to the Korean government. Okay. So it just so happened that the rise in the 60s of the Korean economy coincided with our foreign policy, of this containment policy, of our largesse. And we have the means to do so. Now we compete with Korea. Now we compete with Japan. Now we compete with Germany. But 70 years ago, we actually helped them. We want to make them in our image, to use this religious analogy. Okay? We wanted to prove that capitalism is superior to communism. So now you have seen family, the importance of family. You have seen the rise of Korean economy. And so, but even if America helped them, we could help, let's say, Ghana. We could help, let's say, Bangladesh. We could help Sri Lanka. They would not achieve the same level of economic miracle that the South Koreans did for themselves. So like I said before, I don't want to take it away from the Korean. They emphasize family, they emphasize hard work, they emphasize education, and you cannot make economic progress without a skilled labor force, which they do. They're highly skilled labor force. As I mentioned before, they rank very high in terms of literacy rate, high school graduation rate, college graduation rate, all of the above. Now, education, which to get there, they have to study, they have to work hard. Korean students, both in high school and colleges, and even in elementary school, don't just go to school and go home and play soccer or go home and work at McDonald's. They go to school, then they go home and go to law school. I was a guest for a weekend with a host family during my summer in Korea. My host family, my host father was actually a professor of chemistry. And I spent one weekend at his home. And the father and mother both spoke English, and they described for me their daily life. They have 3 children, which were approximately my own 3 children's age. They had a boy who was 9, 2 girls who was 11 and 12. And after dinner, the first night, the mother asked the children to perform a musical piece for me. They played some classical piece on the flute and on the violin. It was beautiful. The mother, the father, and I sat there and listened. After they were done, before we could ever do anything, like applauding, the father leaned over and whispered to me, Professor Ho, we use first name in Asia. He said to me, thank you for staying with us. I said, oh, it's my honor. I thank you. He said, no, no, no. Without you being here, I would not have taken out the time to listen to my children. This is the first time that I could hear my children perform. Can you believe that? Because back in those days, Korean work week was Monday through Saturday noon, 5.5 days a week. Back then, students go to school for these 3 kids of my host family. They went to school at 6:30 in the morning because the best school for them was in the center of the capital, Seoul. They had to get up early to take the bus in. When they get home, they eat a quick snack and they go to what the Korean call head call, which means after school, cram school. These are for profit, prep school for exams. So just like the old time, where the only way one could get out of one station in life, one could get on a higher position on the totem pole, social totem pole is through education. Nowadays, you still see that vestige of Confucianism in the way they treat education. So all the children in Korea must go to some after school, not just entertainment activity or leisure activity, but more schooling. So that's Confucianism and school, Confucianism and economy, Confucianism and family. I have more story about Hyundai. If you want to know, you can ask me, but now let me see if Professor Doi has any question for me.
I do. Thank you, Ho. Given your much improved standard of living in Korea, would you say the Koreans are happy?
Okay. I did not say this to you all, but my daughter-in-law happens to be Korean. She's actually not 100% Korean, but she considers herself Korean. And so I learned more about from her about Korea as well. Are Korean people happy? Compared to the years immediately after the war, where people were going hungry, literally hungry, like Ireland back in the 1800s, people were really going hungry in Korea. So compared to those days, yes, they're happy. They have high level of income, and they, in fact, they now have a ski resort, they have seaside resorts. So by those measures, they're happy. However, economic success does not come without a price. Okay, I would say at some level they're not happy, or at least in some segment of Korean society, happiness is not something that they have. Take, for example, the suicide rate. Now, if you look at the OECD, that is the Organization for Cooperation and Economic Development, which is a global organization consisting of 37 countries who get together to make economic and social policy. Of those 37 countries, Korea ranked the highest in suicide rate. Suicide rate is measured by the number of suicide per 100,000 people. In Korea, the number is 23.6. I look at mine. And this comes from a New York Times article. It comes from from the World Population Review article that I read recently. So why is it that the suicide rate among a very wealthy country now so high? Well, you can guess that there's so much pressure put on young people to succeed, to do good things for the family, to pass the exam, to get into the best school. If you think of American pressure on our children, it's nothing compared to this constant pressure. Imagine that. So it is not surprising that suicide rate among young people is high in Korea. The other group in Korea where suicide rate is quite high, higher than the norm, is the elderly men in the rural area. Okay, why rural area? When the country was divided into North and South, the South Korea region happened to be poorer than the Northern. The Japanese during the occupation, during colonization from 1910 to 1945, happened to build all the factories, all the minings, and all the facility up in the north. The south was very poor and kept agrarian, agricultural. Okay, so Korea in the south was mostly Korean in the south was mostly employed in the rural sector. And you know, now I just look up the statistic. In Korea, in South Korea now, the percentage of people engaged in farming is only 4.8%. By the way, in the US, our same number is 1.3%, according to the US Department of Agriculture. Okay, if you add into the US case the number of forestry and fishing workers, it would be another 0.3 or 1%, would be 1.6% in the US. It's very low. Fewer people work in farming, and agriculture, and forestry, but we produce more because of mechanization. Same thing with Korea, from nearly 100% to 4.8%. What does that mean? On top of that transition from agriculture to industry, there's also another thing that's happening. It is from countryside to urbanization, from ruralness to urbanization. Now, I mentioned before that Korean population is 51 million. Roughly half of them live in the greater Seoul area, which means young people are living in the countryside, which means old people who are now unemployed and left to themselves can't take care of themselves. Okay. It also means that the value of Confucianism has been eroding even in Korea. So then the young people are no longer, as they have known in generations past, taking care as well or as much of their elderly parents as Korean once did. That's the reason for the higher suicide rate among the elderly people. Now, since I talk about young and old people, I should also mention here one of the big problems facing Korean society now is the low birth rate. Okay, back in 1979, the birth rate per woman in Korea was 2.9. Now, in 2019, 40 years later, it is only 0.9 birth per woman. Now, if you are a demographer, you would know that if a woman has on average 2.1 birth rate, then population would stay stable. It will neither increase nor decrease. For that to happen, each woman in society must have 2.1 birth rate, which means some people are never married, some people cannot conceive, some people are incarcerated, etc. So 2.1 would maintain population at a stable rate. Now 0.9, that means population is decreasing. And this is another side effect of economic development. You see that in Sweden, you see that in Germany, you see that in the US, you see that in Japan. As a country becomes wealthier, women are more liberated. They don't have to have children anymore. They can delay the marriage. They can pursue other things in life. And that's exactly what happened in the last few decades with Korean young women, which some people would say also the erosion of Confucius values. And that is a ticking time bomb facing Korean. Imagine the population pyramid. If there's the number of birth is decreasing, eventually the top of the pyramid where the older people are would be wider. I mean, I'm exaggerating here, right? But if with fewer younger people working to support elderly population, something must give. And we already see that in our country with the social security system. There are now fewer workers of people working age compared to the number of people like myself who are retirees. So keep on working, please. We need your support. Now, so that's, but the biggest problem, of course, is uniquely Korean or South Korean. Ever since its creation in September 1945, it had faced an ever-present threat of invasion from the north. The invasion did materialize in June 1950 with the north swarming down across the 38th parallel. In fact, the north in the initial weeks was so powerful and so successful, it pushed the Southern Army, which was very weak at the time. The Southern Army didn't even have airplane or tanks or big howitzer. And with the few thousand American troops, the North pushed them all the way to a toehold in the southern tip of the peninsula around the port city of Busan. It was then American came in force with an amphibious landing and pushed the Northern Army up, pushed them up, all the way to the Chinese border. And I can say this without any hesitation, it was American military arrogance. When Douglas MacArthur was warned that don't push too far, don't go into China because the Chinese could come in, he said, let them come in, we can take care of them. They came in, we could not take care of them. And that's how there is now not a truce, not peace, but what we call Emeritus, which is a ceasefire, but not a formal truce. Okay, and so legally the two countries are still at war, and the North Korean has a very strong army of 1.3 million soldiers. The South only has about half that, about 600,000. And the North also has something that the South can never have: nuclear power. And that's what the South Koreans have to live with, this threat hanging over their heads. So population decline, threat for the North. So you ask me if Koreans are happy, I would say yes, compared to the days of famine and starvation, yes. The day of unemployment, yes. But they have to live in this bubble that may burst. I welcome any question now.
You may have already addressed this indirectly with some of the comments that you had. I was thinking on low birth rate and how you suggested that there are things that Korea needs to worry about. But what one challenge do you think they face? One most important. I know the low birth rate, I know the threat from the North, but can you think of something else that you consider to be a central challenge that they need to face today?
Well, that's a wide range of issues we can discuss, right? But how to make people happier. They now have the means, they have achieved a certain level of development where it is possible to share the wealth. And this is the point here. In economics, we have something which we call Gini coefficient, capital G-I-N-I. It is named after an Italian economist by the name of Gini. Professor Gini came up with this number from 0 to 1, okay, to measure income inequality within a country. And Korea is not doing well because Korea, in its development in the 60s and the 70s, focused on what we call chaebol. Chaebol is Korean word for family-owned conglomerates. Some of the names I mentioned before: Hyundai, Samsung, LG, Daewoo, Sangyong, and so on are all names of big conglomerates or corporation, which unlike Apple, unlike Microsoft, unlike Tesla, all these Korean conglomerates or chaebol owned by one family. So wealth is highly concentrated. The reason chaebol were developed in Korea is because of a man named Park Chung-hee. Park Chung-hee was a general who had a coup d'etat in 1961, installed himself as the leader. He was a general. And in 1963, he became president. And he stayed president until 1979, when he was assassinated by his friend and head of the Korean CIA, Korean Central Intelligence Agency. Okay. So Park Chung-hee was in power from 1961 until 1979. That was the time that Korea rose dramatically, economically. Now, he was a dictator. He didn't care much for human rights, but he did focus on economic development. He nationalized Bank of Korea, and he used the Bank of Korea to channel investment to certain industry. He used what he called guided capitalism, which some economists call crony capitalism. Under Park Chung-hee, guided capitalism means the government, Bureau of Economic Planning, pick and choose which industry to develop. Is heavy industry, chemical industry, shipyard industry, steel industry, pick them, and then pick the companies, the chaebol, to give the investment money to do that. It's almost like a communistic or socialistic system of central planning. That's what Korean did, except they call it guided capitalism. Now, American would not have, American policymaker would not accept that now. But remember, this happened with the background of the Cold War. We looked the other way. We let it happen. We helped them because we wanted to succeed so that the North would not attack them. So communist China and Soviet Union would not be able to penetrate, would not be able to knock over these dominoes. So Park Chung-hee, for better or for worse, was responsible for the initial stages of this creation. But now the wealth is concentrated in a few families, and Korean people are not happy with that. Now, by the way, since I mentioned Hyundai so many times, I should say something about the founder. His name was Chung Yu-young. He was born in 1915 at a village in the north. His family was a very poor peasant family. He has 5 brothers and 1 sister. He was the oldest. Now, speaking of filial piety, all his 5 brothers, not his sister, became part of the management of Hyundai later and different branches. By the way, Hyundai doesn't just make cars, they build ships, they build the biggest shipyard, they build ports, they have mining company, they have steel mills and so on, steel plants. And so Mr. Chung was from a very poor family. He only opened a garage in Seoul in 1945 when the country was divided. And what did he do in 1945? His garage serviced American military vehicles. You know, American had a presence in Korea. So it had jeep, it had trucks, it had tanks, some tanks. It needed oil change, it needed tire changing. So that's what Mr. Chung of Hyundai did. And when the Korean War ended in 1953, the South Korea needed rebuilding. They need to dredge port, they need to build ports, they need to build roads and bridges. He became the contractor. Okay, one of his brother went to school in America, Miami University in Ohio, not in Miami, but Ohio, called Miami University. One of his brother went to university and became very fluent in English. And that also helped him connect with American military in Korea, which are still in Korea now, right? So then in the 60s, when America built up its effort in Vietnam, it was natural to ask the Chung brothers, Nguyen, to come over to dredge the port, to build the port, to build the road, to build the airports. And that's where Mr. Chung and Nguyen brought tens of thousands of foreign workers over to Vietnam. So just like Japan benefited by American war effort in Korea for 3 years, Korea now in the 60s and early 70s benefited from American war effort in Vietnam. And when Vietnam War ended by 1975, the Hyundai company already had expertise in road building, airport construction, and so on. It moved over to the Middle East. Okay, and the Middle East was expanding rapidly with its new wealth found in oil. So that's how Hyundai made its fortune, starting from changing oil for US Jeeps, basically, to now one of the 10 largest automakers. And shipbuilding, Korea is only after China in terms of tonnage of shipbuilding. China makes something like 22 million tons of ships a year. Korea is right behind it, 20 or 21 million tons. Japan is distant third, 18 million tons. I don't even know who number 4 is, but it's not the US. So what is one issue? They have the means to make people happier. And that would be to erase the corruption that exists between the wealthy Chaebol family and the government. At least three South Korean presidents that I know of was put in jail because of corruption.
Thank you, Ho. We have just a little time left, but would you attribute Korea's success with COVID control to Confucianism?
Well, yes, because people toe the line, people obey the law, people respect the law, people think beyond themselves. They don't put on the mask just for themselves, they do it for their neighbors, their family, their community, their nation. And that's why Vietnam, Taiwan, Singapore, those other countries that have heavy Confucian influence, and Japan, they're all very successful. People don't mind listening to what should be done. I think Confucianism has something to do with it. So this sense of, there's something greater than oneself. If you recall, in January 1961, which is basically 3 months before I came to this country, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the youngest and the first Catholic president of this country. And his speech, inaugural speech, was one of the best known inaugural speeches. And there's one line that is now engraved at his gravesite. And if I recite it, you would know. My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That smack of Confucius value. But in this case, it takes an American president to say that to American people. Ask not what you can do for not what your family can do for you, but what you can do for your family. Ask not what Hyundai can do for you, ask what you can do for your company. That's so ingrained in a Confucius system. Let me have a minute to share one story. I was advisor to exchange students from Asia, And the first student from Hong Kong who came to my college, on the first day, I gave her advice and told her what courses to take. And as she left my office, I said, good luck, do well. She turned around and said to me, Dr. Ho, I have to do well. I cannot let my university down. This is a 20-year-old young lady from Hong Kong. Clearly, there was something Confucius about what she said and how she felt. I also advise American students going to our exchange partner in China, in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, and so on. I can never, and I would not even tell them, I cannot imagine any of my nice American students would say to me, Professor Nguyen, I have to do my best so I cannot let St. Mary's College, Maryland down. You see the difference.
And beyond that, they're opening baseball stadiums in Texas to full capacity. And there's a problem that we have with people wearing masks and social distancing, doing what's best, right? What I can do for my family. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. So thank you, Ho. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
I appreciate it. With that, I will also thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.